You're listening to Speaking Sidemount, the podcast where we talk all things sidemount diving, from equipment, skills, techniques, and sidemount diving expeditions to interviews with some of the world's top sidemount divers. Whether you're new to sidemount, been sidemount diving for years, or just want to know more, this is the place for all things sidemount. I'm your host, Steve Davis. Let's get wet. Hey, welcome back to Speaking Sidemount. I'm Steve Davis. Man, I have been having a ball with all these interviews with amazing sidemount divers from around the world. To date, I've interviewed Thomas Michura, Steve Bogarts, Gary Dallas, Brian K. Cook, Jill Heineth, and Audrey Cadell, and I have a heap more lined up for the coming months. You gotta love podcasts. I don't know another medium or location other than Speaking Sidemount where you could get the opportunity to listen and learn from such phenomenal divers. Your support and feedback has been amazing, and I'm proud and at the very same time humbled to be able to bring this information to you. And that brings me to a special announcement. Much as I love doing this podcast, there is a mountain of work in conceiving the topic for each episode, developing the content, booking interview guests, conducting the interviews, editing, and then finally delivering on each episode. On top of that, I'm also responding to a growing number of daily questions and comments from listeners. There's also costs in terms of equipment and podcast hosting, and all of this is taking away from my other activities and businesses on which I rely to make a living. Now, many podcasts have sponsors, and while I struggled with this initially, I've decided to seek sponsorship support to cover my time and also support the further growth that I know we can achieve with Speaking Sidemount. I'm very conscious of protecting both my personal and also the integrity of this podcast. I will only ever work with sponsors of whom I either use and love their equipment or I would love to use their product. I hope that makes sense. And so, I'm very pleased to announce that XDeep has kindly agreed to support Speaking Sidemount and will sponsor some of our podcast episodes on an ongoing basis. I have been a very happy XDeep Stealth 2.0 diver for over 5 years, right from the classic all the way through to my current setup using the Stealth 2.0 tech system. Their build quality is awesome and support excellent. XDeep's support of this podcast is also another sign that they encourage the growth of the sidemount community and also the sharing of ideas and knowledge on sidemount diving. I am very grateful of this support, and I want to personally thank Peter and the team at XDeep for coming on board as the first sponsor of Speaking Sidemount. I'll be bringing on a limited number of additional sponsors based on the criteria I just mentioned, and this will help the continued growth of Speaking Sidemount. So on with this week's episode. As I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, the response to the podcast interviews has been overwhelmingly positive, and at the same time, I know there are many of you looking for specific details on sidemount, and I've been thinking hard. How do I cater for you all, given that I know that there are many listeners who are very new sidemount divers, and there are also some with years of experience, maybe explorers, or even sidemount instructors. I'm also very aware that there are a number of ways of doing it right in sidemount, and the way that I dive may not be the same way that you dive. Having said that, I think there are a number of principles that we would all agree on. Things like streamlining, managing equipment, gas management, and so on. There's also the aspect of your configuration equipment being fit for purpose. That is, a cave explorer setup would not be the same as the setup you would use on an open water dive or a decompression dive. So what I intend to do alongside the interviews is intersperse podcast episodes that are specific to the fundamentals of sidemount diving. Things like equipment setup, training, skills, and the ongoing skills development that we all need to become better sidemount divers. In some cases, I'll incorporate interviews with top sidemount divers that have experience in the area that we're covering. This information will then give you the foundation that you could use to take your sidemount diving into environments such as caves, wrecks, or decompression diving. To be clear, and I hope it goes without saying, in each case you should take a course which will layer the skills and knowledge that you need to enter each of these environments. Ideally, you would choose an instructor for each environment that also teaches sidemount diving, but this is not really that important. For instance, I did my advanced wreck training in sidemount with John Chatterton. Now, John's a backmount and CCR diver. However, I chose him because he's one of the world's leading wreck divers, and it was wreck diving knowledge and skills that I was seeking. Now, having said that, I'd completed sidemount essentials, intro to cave, and advanced nitrox and deco procedures training all in sidemount before I took a course with John. and I had over 2 years and 150 side mount dives under my belt, and boy, it was just as well. We were boat diving in ripping currents in Florida, so I needed every bit of that experience to be able to complete the course alongside my fellow students. So today, we'll start the first episode on side mount fundamentals and start our deep dive into equipment. We'll go over the basics on each piece of equipment and then delve deeper into each aspect, and also add in a few tips and tricks that I've learned and observed over the years. Your feedback on this will be awesome. Please let me know what you think. So, let's get wet. When we think of side mount, the quintessential piece of equipment is the side mount harness, and there are a lot to choose from. In my interview with Brian Kaycock, he estimated that there are over 60 different harnesses on the market, and it seems as though every manufacturer wants to have a unit in their product catalog. Now, in the early days, cave explorers and divers looking at side mount made their own equipment to accomplish the dives that they had in mind, and they evolved their harnesses to solve specific issues that they came across. This meant that many of the early harnesses were very minimalist and really comprised little more than a shoulder, waist and crotch strap with some D-rings, cylinder attachment points, and maybe an MSR or dromedary bag as a BCD, or no BCD at all. Then the side mount was picked up in places like Florida where there are deeper, high-flow caves, or in areas where they are diving in cold water. Larger steel cylinders came into use. Now, steel cylinders meant that harnesses and BCDs needed to be able to cope with the additional weight of a cylinder that remained negative throughout the dive. BCDs became larger with a greater lift capacity, and butt rails were fitted to carry and trim steel cylinders. Now, over time, cave explorers became involved in the commercial development of harnesses, such as Lamar Highs at Dive Right, Steve Bogarts with the Razor, and Patrick Weidman with the X-Deep Stealth 2.0 range. We now have some exceptional harnesses to choose from, so the $1,000 question is which one? Well, the answer is preceded by some questions. Before choosing a harness, ask yourself, what type of side mount diving are you going to be doing most of the time? Are you in warm water or cold water? A dry suit or a wetsuit? Steel or aluminium cylinders? 2 cylinders, or will you be also looking to carry stage or decompression cylinders? What if you're doing all of the above, like I am? Okay, let's first look at what makes up a good side mount harness. Number 1, the harness itself should be minimalist, and by that I mean it needs good quality webbing, shoulder straps, a waist, or should I say a hip strap, a crotch strap, and it should be reasonably easy to adjust and fit to your body, but devoid of bulk and padding, which just adds unnecessary buoyancy. It needs to have chest D-rings to which you'll clip at various times, regulators, lights, stage cylinders, and double enders. It needs to have a butt D-ring for clipping spools, for example, crotch D-ring as a DPV or scooter attachment, and a method to attach your cylinder bungees at the back and to the shoulder straps. You should have sliding D-rings on the hip strap or waist strap, and a way to attach the BCD and a weight system. Sounds simple, right? Now, number 2, it should have a modular weight system where weight can be positioned along the length of the diver's back to facilitate trim adjustments. Additional trim pockets or weight attachments should also be available to allow for trim or balance adjustments. Now, bear in mind, most systems do not have ditchable weights. Obviously, ditching weights is a recreational open water strategy of last resort in the event of an issue. This simply won't work, and in fact will make matters worse in an overhead environment, or if you have a virtual overhead in terms of a decompression obligation. Bottom line in technical diving is be correctly weighted with redundant buoyancy sources. Number 3, it should have a BCD, of course. Firstly, it should have sufficient lift for the diving and the equipment you are carrying. Now, having said that, more lift is not necessarily better, so you should absolutely know your weighting and carry no more weight than you need for a specific dive and the equipment that you have. You therefore need only enough lift to counter the change in your buoyancy due to depth. More on this when we get to setup in the skills section. Now, your BCD should allow for the lift to be in the mid to lower portion of your back, allowing for it to be at or very near your centers of gravity and buoyancy. The BCD needs to be very fitting. It can't balloon away or provide lift where you don't need it. It should be able to dump gas while you're in trim. That is, you don't need to change to a vertical or side-on position as we did in our open water days. The inflator should be robust and very easy to access, streamlined, and protected from damage. The BCD itself needs to be very well protected, especially for those that are cave or wreck diving. I can't tell you how many times I've got out of the water with mud or rust covering the back of the BCD. I call them tags of honor. However, You need to know that you can rely on your BCD in close quarters with wrecks and caves. Lastly, ideally your BCD will have redundant buoyancy, particularly if you're going to be diving in a wetsuit. So I've covered what to look for. What should you avoid? I do not recommend hybrid systems built to accommodate either back or side mount. These systems are disproportionately represented in examples of poor side mount diving. These systems typically have way too much bulk and are not easy to adjust for optimal cylinder hold, and so do not lend themselves to a side mount system that is balanced and stable in all orientations. Now, when I did my training, I actually chose all of my equipment based on my instructor's recommendations. Now, before you take this advice, be sure that your instructor and his or her students are showing the skill set that you want to achieve. In my case, I've been heavily influenced by Steve Bogarts and his students Steve Martin and Jason Renaud. If you haven't seen these guys in the water, then check them out. That was the standard that I wanted and why I started to dive in side mount. I ultimately completed my side mount essentials and intro to cave training with Jason using the X-Deep Stealth Classic 2.0. Next, I want to talk about some key areas you need to look at when setting your harness up. Obviously, giving you audio instructions on fitting is not the best way to go, and you should absolutely have your harness fitted by a good instructor who knows the system you've chosen. This will save you a mountain of time in getting your system right. Having said that, there are a few key areas of focus that you should attend to. I'll list these off so that you can make sure that you reference them when you're fitting your harness. Firstly, make sure the harness nodes are positioned correctly. The top node or plate should be between your shoulder blades and the bottom node in the middle of your lumbar spine. Check and ensure that the hip strap is indeed positioned low on your hips and is not up on your waist. If it's too high, you will not get enough length to provide positive hold of your cylinders via the bottom bolt snap. Check that your chest D-rings are level with your armpits. Make sure that you adjust the lengths of the shoulder, hip, and crotch straps to fit you snugly. Wear your exposure protection when you do this and allow enough room for changes between wet and dry suits, thin or thick undergarments, depending on the diving you do. Don't make the really expensive mistake that I've done a couple of times by cutting the straps too short and not allowing for these changes. Now, when you're looking at bungees to hold the top of the cylinders, loop bungees 100% give you the best hold of your cylinders and provide a really neat external torque or rotation of the cylinders that pulls them in tightly to your body. The loop should be horizontal in alignment when standing and be at the height of your armpits. Now, I use a sliding rubber ring or a small bungee loop attached to the front of the shoulder strap to correctly locate the loop bungee. Gary Dallas made an excellent video of this, and I'll put a link to that in the podcast notes. Check that the weight system positioning provides you with the best trim and balance. By this I mean get in the water, test your trim and weighting, and move the weight up or down to support correct trim. It's a great idea to video yourself in the water to see exactly what is going on. Sliding D-rings on your hip strap are generally much better than using rails even with steel cylinders. I dive 12 litre or 85 cubic foot steels. At the beginning of a dive, the sliding D-rings are approaching the rear part of my pelvis, approximately 30 degrees back from my midline. As they lose weight and buoyancy through the dive, I gradually move the D-rings forward, so when my cylinders are at 50 bar or 750 psi, the D-rings are 30 to 45 degrees forward of my midline. The 12 litre cylinders are about half a kilo or a pound negative, but there is definitely a change on them through the dive. With aluminium cylinders, the change is much more pronounced and they become buoyant below 120 bar or 1800 psi, and they are really buoyant at about 50 bar or 750 psi. When diving, I pay particular attention to cylinder trim, and I don't tolerate cylinders that are either too low or too high. It's easy to adjust, so I just do it. And remember back to episode 2 where I talked about the importance of trim and streamlining. While there are some modular BCDs like the Stealth Classic, the BCD will typically attach to the harness at the top and bottom and have some kind of side attachment either to the harness itself or that will wrap around your body to keep the sides of the BCD in close. Thinking of your trim in particular, the center of buoyancy for the BCD should be as close as possible to your center of gravity, or the point through which your weight acts. If you have your weight system in the right position, this should be close to the middle of your lumbar spine. Now, as you inflate your BCD to compensate for loss of buoyancy as you descend, the lift should be now acting on your center. That is, you will not compromise your trim. Getting this right may take a few dives, but it's well worth the effort to test this and make adjustments after each dive to iterate towards a balanced rig which will allow you to be more relaxed while you dive. Now I hope that helps with harness setup. Next we're going to talk about side mount cylinders and regulators. When discussing cylinders, the first question is invariably the cylinder material, steel or aluminium or aluminum as our American friends would say. The answer is, it depends. A good side mount diver should be able to dive both cylinder types, but it's worth spending some time discussing when it makes sense to use each type. Steel cylinders are typically similar weight to aluminium cylinders out of the water. The difference lies in the buoyancy characteristics of the cylinder in the water and as the gas is consumed during a dive. The thickness and relative density of aluminium cylinders mean that they will go from 1 to 2 kilos or 2.2 to 4.4 pounds negative at the beginning of the dive to 1 to 2 kilos, that's again 2.2 or 4.4 pounds positive when they're at 30 bar or 450 psi. This change in buoyancy means that a diver will need to be weighted such that they're neutral at 3 to 6 meters in depth when their cylinders are at 30 bar, it's 10 to 20 feet or 450 psi. And your buoyancy control device needs to be empty when you're doing this check. Now in contrast, steel cylinders will lose buoyancy equivalent to the weight of gas consumed, and they'll remain slightly negative or neutral at 30 bar. Now diving steel cylinders usually means the divers will be required to carry less weight to offset their change in buoyancy. The information would lead to some general advice on cylinder selection. For me, if I'm diving in warm water, say above 26 Celsius, about 80 Fahrenheit, and a 5mm wetsuit or less, then I'd choose an aluminium cylinder. In colder water, say under 24 Celsius, 75 Fahrenheit, or for technical dives, or where I'm in a 7mm wetsuit or dry suit, then I may choose a steel cylinder. If you're diving in fresh water, you're going to have less buoyancy. So this means probably you'll use aluminium cylinders unless it's very cold and you're using a dry suit with thick undergarments, where you may look at steel cylinders again. A couple of last points in terms of cylinder types. When you're traveling, you're definitely going to come across more aluminium cylinders than steel, so the ability to work with them is going to be really important. And then secondly, when you're looking at managing cylinders, so from the first perspective, if you think of your left cylinder and your right cylinder, if you need to take them off, let's say you're moving through restrictions and so on, then it can be easier to manage those cylinders when they're neutrally buoyant or close to that. And then related to that point is if you've got stage or deco cylinders, they absolutely should be aluminum or aluminium cylinders for the same reason. They're much, much easier to manage than steel cylinders, and obviously you don't want to be carrying all that weight of an additional steel cylinder on your system. So a few more points to consider as you look at cylinder types. When you look at cylinder size, cylinders come in a huge range of shapes, sizes, and volumes, and most can be accommodated in side mount, but where possible, I recommend that divers select 12-litre steel cylinders, that's 85 cubic feet, or 11-litre aluminium cylinders, that's 80 cubic feet. The reasoning for this is the length, diameter, weight, and available gas volumes of these cylinders mean they fit well for side mount diving and can be used on a wide range of dives. They'll also map really well to mixed team diving, where DIR back mount divers are often using two 12-litre cylinders in their twin set setup. Smaller cylinders such as 10-litre steels or 72 cubic feet might be considered, and these need to be configured as for your initial setup to make sure that you've got your trim and stability set up right. You could also look at heavy steel such as 15-litre or larger, but generally I tend to avoid these, but if you need to, of course, yes, you can set these up, and this is where your butt rails on your harness might become important. When looking at cylinder valves, DIN valves should be chosen over less secure yoke connections. And as in back mount twin set, side mount diving requires a set of cylinders with modular right and left-handed valves. This means that the valve hand wheels can be set up with each to the outside, providing the best accessibility. It is possible to dive with two right-hand or two left-hand valves. However, this should only be done where modular valves are not available. And I've had this happen plenty of times when I'm traveling. The valves will need to have plugged extension posts where they might otherwise have been connected to a manifold for twin set diving. This allows for the post to be used as an attachment for the cylinder via an upper loop bungee. Another aspect of setting your cylinders up is hardware. You'll need additional hardware for the lower attachment point of the cylinder to a D-ring on the waist strap of the side mount harness. Cam bands are sometimes used for this, however experience has shown that using a stainless steel Jubilee clip with sheathing is a very effective alternative. A medium-sized bolt snap is attached to the cylinder clamped by a length of 3 to 4 mm paracord, providing a positive and easily managed connection to the lower part of the cylinder. In very cold water where dry gloves are worn, a larger bolt snap may be required. When you're using steel cylinders, they often come with a rubber tank boot. I tend to remove the tank boot. My reasoning for that is I don't want to carry anything extra in the water that I don't require in the water. And secondly, it does make the cylinder a little longer, and so I tend to prefer removing them. There isn't really anything wrong with leaving it on though, so that's really up to you. Next I want to look at regulators and hoses. A dedicated side mount regulator sets are now available from several manufacturers, along with the option to reconfigure regulators used on back mount twin set systems. The following describes the optimal regulator setup and hose lengths for side mount diving. Firstly, 2 high-performance tin regulators with rotating low-pressure turrets and a 5th LP port for inflator hoses are by far the best way to go for managing hoses and routing hoses when stowing. For the very common Bogarthian type setup now, you're going to use a left short hose regulator set up with a 60 to 65 centimeter, that's 24 to 26 inches, of LP regulator hose and a right angled second stage right side connection. So what I mean by that is it's coming from your right side, and that hose routes from your left cylinder around and over your neck and coming in from your right side. Now to the short hose, you're going to attach a bungee necklace to the mouthpiece, and I use a 20 centimeter or 8 inch BCD inflator hose which attaches to the 5th LP port on the regulator. And then I have a 15 to 20 centimeter or 6 to 8 inch HP SPG hose connected to a small to mid-size SPG, and this hose routes down along the line of the cylinder. You do occasionally see side mount divers with their SPGs mounted in an upward direction. This gives you really good access to them in terms of being able to see your gauges, but the downside is that it does not give you a streamlined profile, and my feeling is that it creates clutter around the area of your body that you really want to be clean and accessible. So I don't recommend doing that. I vastly prefer mounting them along the cylinders, and they're still really easy to get to and see. The last aspect of looking at cylinders and regulators is hose retaining bands, and I use 3 of these, 1 for the left short hose cylinder and 2 for the right long hose cylinder for stowing that long hose. There are many commercially available options made from elastic material that are really good for this purpose. Thicker bands that are 75 millimeters wide are less prone to coming off when you're stowing hoses and also when you're deploying the long hose. And if you're looking for a recommendation on wider bands, I use the Deluxe bands that come out of Germany, and I'll put a link to those in the podcast notes so that you can have a look at those. Now, having said all of that, the smaller 20 millimeter bands do work well. You just have to make sure that they stay in place and that you're not constantly having to reposition your hose retaining band after it comes off, which is to stay the least a pain in the butt. Now, if you're looking for a low-cost alternative, a car tire inner tube can be cut to make adequate hose retaining bands if budget is a bit of a problem there. Either way you go, it is useful to have a tab on the band to make it easier to pull it away from the cylinder when you're stowing hoses. The commercially available models generally come with a tab, or one can be fashioned for the tire tube bands with some duct tape. Well, I hope this foundational series and some tips that I've given here has been useful. I know there'll be many divers out there who dive slightly differently and maybe different hose lengths, yada, yada, yada. But the bottom line is I hope the underlying principles that I've covered here are valuable to you and that you can find something that will help you with your diving. Now, in our next episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the X-Deep Stealth 2.0 systems, and I'm really pleased to be able to talk to one of my great role models in side mount diving, Patrick Weidman. Patrick's a renowned cave explorer with a vast resume of record-setting exploration projects around the world. He owns Protect Dive Centers in Mexico, but more importantly for this particular episode, Patrick is the inventor of the Stealth 2.0 side mount system and continues to work with X-Deep in the development of this system. So I can't wait to talk to Patrick on this, and I'm sure you'll be looking forward to it too. All this and much more coming in our next episode of Speaking Side Mount. You've been listening to Speaking Side Mount from www.sidemountpros.com. If you like the podcast, please subscribe and consider leaving us a 5-star review. If there's something you'd like us to cover on the show, then let us know via our Facebook page listed in the podcast notes. Thanks again, and we look forward to you joining us on our next episode of Speaking Side Mount.